Greetings. My name is Dr. Jeffrey Ogle. I am with the College of Contemporary Liberal Studies at Regis University. My area of specialization is philosophy, but I have a deep and abiding interest in the area of positive psychology. So I'm very pleased to be able to offer you this webinar today entitled The Power of Positive Psychology in a Difficult Time. I'd like to start out by doing something in this webinar. I want you to do something with me. Um, so this is an exercise, and what it can do is it can decrease your negative emotions, anxiety, for instance. Maybe you have some anxiety right now, and increase positive emotion. It can make you feel calm and content. Some other things as well. Grateful, uh, as you'll see. Okay, so anyway, let me do the exercise, then say something about it. When I do it, you'll see, oh, I see how this works. It's pretty intuitive. And then I'll give you a chance to do it. Okay, so I want to tell you what I'm grateful for. Number one, I am grateful that I'm staying home with my family. They're in the house behind me. I'm not separated from them. So I'm grateful for that. Number two, I am employed. I've been sent home from my job in my office, but I do have a job, and so that's great, and I'm grateful for that. And number three, let me pick something simple. I got to have coffee today. In fact, I went to the drive-through at Starbucks and got a cafe mocha, and I don't allow myself to do that most days. I try to stay at home as much as possible, but today I treated myself and I had a cafe mocha, and I'm pretty stoked about it, to be honest. Okay, so you see how this exercise works. Martin Seligman, who I'll say a bit more about later, calls this the three blessings exercise. It's just a matter of listing three blessings, three things that one is grateful for. Like I said, decreases negative emotion, it increases positive emotion. Here's the best way to do this thing. I mean, I want you to do it with me right now. We're getting to that. But what would really help you is to write down three things that you're grateful for at the end of the day, before you go to bed. This will frame uh, things for you at the end of the day. You know, you'll have a positive frame, a positive spin on things right at the end of the day. You write down those three things, then you go to bed. You'll probably sleep better. You do this for a week, and according to the scientific literature, you're going to feel better 6 months later. And that's because people like this exercise so much that they keep doing it. And so that accounts for why even 6 months later, they still feel better. Okay, so it's your turn. And let me just warn you before you get your turn, that you want to state what you're grateful for in a positive, affirmative way as much as possible. Try not to use the word not, is how we could put it. Say I'm grateful for such and such, rather than I'm grateful that I don't have such and such. I'm grateful that this is happening rather than I'm grateful that such and such other thing is not happening. So, for instance, I could have said I'm grateful that I'm not sick, that I don't have COVID-19 as far as I know. It would be better to say, um, I'm grateful that I'm healthy. That would be fine. So part of this is just a matter of framing. But in any case, yeah, be affirming and positive. All right, now it's your turn. Okay, now that we've got an exercise under our belt, let me introduce positive psychology to you. Perhaps that's what you expected me to do at first, but I wanted to start with doing something. Positive psychology is about health assets rather than about sickness or about health liabilities. Martin Seligman is a prominent name in positive psychology. I would say he started the discipline, and it partly grew out of his clinical practice. Okay, so he would have patients come to him who were very anxious or clinically depressed. He would work with these patients to overcome the anxiety or the depression, and then he would find that, as he put it, well, they were just zombies at that point. They were just shells of themselves. Once they overcame these negative problems, they didn't know how to live. They didn't know how to proceed with life once they got past those problems. And so it occurred to Martin Seligman, what do we need to live well? I mean, what are the positive assets that we need to have in order to live well, in order to flourish? And that's what positive psychology is really about. It's about those positive assets that we need in order to live well. It is with this conception of positive psychology in mind that we offer this webinar to you. We want you to build up your psychological strength, and I would even go so far as to say we want you to explore your individual psychological strengths and build those up in order to deal in a healthy way with the novel coronavirus and with COVID-19. To understand positive psychology as Martin Seligman conceives it, we need to understand what PERMA is. Now, as the slide indicates, PERMA is a construct. That is, it's a concept that we devised, we made it up. But the point of the concept or the construct is to track something real, of course, and that real thing that the construct of PERMA is tracking is happiness or human flourishing. So Martin Seligman has determined with his research that there are these 5 different elements of human flourishing. We can't measure human flourishing directly. We don't know how to do it. We measure these 5 elements instead, and what clues us in to these being elements of flourishing is that each one of them is pursued for its own sake. Each one of them is considered intrinsically valuable by humans across cultures, across times, different historical periods. Okay, so that's what PERMA is in general. And then, of course, we have to think about what PERMA is in terms of the various elements that compose it. Okay, so again, as the slide indicates, P is positive emotion. Martin Seligman used to talk about happiness quite a bit before he started talking about human flourishing, but he found that when he said happiness, people just naturally thought of positive emotion, but the problem with that is positive emotion is just one of 5 elements. Okay, so PERMA can't be identified with positive emotion. Rather, positive emotion is one element of PERMA among others. Another part of PERMA, element of PERMA, is engagement. In other words, being involved, being absorbed, getting into the flow. So, of course, we'll talk about this more later. Our relationships, we're social beings, of course. So, our flourishing, human flourishing, has to involve relationships, having relationships, cultivating relationships, maintaining relationships. M is for meaning. That's something of a philosophical topic, but it's important for human beings to have meaningful lives. Positive psychology tells us this independently of philosophy. Finally, we have A standing for accomplishment. We need to accomplish things in our lives, goals, projects, purposes, and we need to feel accomplished in order to flourish as human beings. We're just about ready to start discussing the individual elements of PERMA one by one. We want to go through each one, make sure we understand that element, and in fact, we'll tie a positive intervention to each one of those elements. So let me say something about positive interventions. You've heard of an intervention, right? You've heard of a drug intervention. When people try to help an addict, they try to get that person to see what he or she is doing wrong and stop it, find some kind of motivation to stop and to do better, right? So we're used to thinking about interventions as things that we do to stop bad behavior, to prevent bad outcomes, right? But in positive psychology, we get positive interventions, right? And of course, a positive intervention is intended to facilitate or bring about a good outcome or good behavior, right? So we've already done a positive intervention. We did the three blessings exercise, and we've got five more positive interventions ahead of us. In connection with positive interventions, we should say something about the G.I. Joe fallacy. That is, in fact, what it's called in the scientific literature, the G.I. Joe fallacy. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, probably both. I watched a cartoon called G.I. Joe. Some of you will have seen it. And at the end of the cartoon, there was always some kind of general message to kids telling them to avoid this or do that. And G.I. Joe would say, "Knowing is half the battle," right? So you've probably heard this phrase, "Knowing is half the battle." Well, that's the G.I. Joe fallacy, right? It's fallacious, it's incorrect to think that knowing about positive psychology will make you better. That's not how it works. You have to act on the principles of positive psychology in order to improve your life, in order to improve yourself, in order to improve your mental health. So, knowing is not half the battle. It's significantly less than half. Perhaps it's very little, right? And this idea is actually a very old idea, although we can thank Laurie Santos and Tamar Gendler for this idea of the G.I. Joe fallacy specifically. The more general idea that knowing isn't enough goes back to Aristotle. And in his Nicomachean Ethics, excuse me, he said, look, the point of ethics is to get better, right? So studying ethics as a theory, it's not too helpful, right? That's not going to make you better, but you have to act on ethical principles, right? Insofar as we are able to state them, and Aristotle has a lot to say actually about the trouble with stating ethical principles. Nevertheless, he does offer general guidance, and again says it's not enough to know these things. Rather, you must do something. You must act on the guidance that I'm giving you. Otherwise, it will not be beneficial. We are now ready to discuss the five elements of PERMA, which is our construct standing in for human happiness, human flourishing. You might recall that P in PERMA is for positive emotion. Okay, so we're not going to discuss negative emotions. We're not going to discuss anxiety, how you might reduce your anxiety level. We'll leave that to others since this is a webinar on positive psychology. Now, what's good about positive emotions? You're probably thinking, well, they feel good, right? and that maybe that's all there is to it. Positive emotions just feel good. Well, actually, there's a fairly elaborate theory about what's good about positive emotions. This theory has been put forward by Barbara Fredrickson. Okay, so her idea, and there is of course some empirical backing for this, her idea is that positive emotions broaden and build. What does that mean? Well, she's approaching this from a biological and even an evolutionary perspective. I will say this about negative emotions: they often alert you to a threat in the environment, and they give you the energy you need to avoid that threat or to fight that threat, right? Now, positive emotions aren't like that. Negative emotions narrow your attention on the threat, okay? And then positive emotions actually do the opposite. That's the broaden part of the broaden and build theory. Positive emotions broaden your attention. They'll allow you to take in more of your environment than you would if you weren't experiencing the positive emotion. And as a result, you can build resources through positive emotions. That is to say, you have to imagine eons, right? So this is an evolutionary point of view, as I've mentioned. Over time, as a certain group of hominids experiences more positive emotion, they're more in tune with their environment. They notice more water sources. They notice different kinds of herbs that they could eat or that they could use to digest other foods, something like this, right? So broadening the attention, at least some of the time, leads to building up of resources. Furthermore, being in a good mood leads others to want to be around you. And of course, for Homo sapiens sapiens, sociality is extremely important. We rely on each other quite a bit, right? So naturally, being in a good mood builds up your social resources, right? And that's basically how the broaden and build theory works. Barbara Fredrickson refers to the following positive emotions as the Big Ten: love, joy, gratitude, serenity, interest, hope, pride, amusement, inspiration, and awe. Notice she's included interest on this list. So if this webinar is of interest to you, then you are cultivating positive emotion as you watch it and engage with it. Just being able to name the positive emotions is helpful. Knowing precisely what to cultivate should help us cultivate it. Now let's connect our discussion of positive emotion to a specific positive intervention. You know what savoring is. It's not an unusual word. Savoring involves focusing your attention on something that you're already enjoying. Now, from a technical point of view, this creates a higher order enjoyment on top of the first order pleasure or gratification that you were already experiencing. There are a few tricks you can do to manipulate yourself into paying extra special attention to a pleasure or a gratification or a positive emotion. Here are three things you can do. Number one, you can tell a friend about the positive emotion. Number two, suppose you don't have anybody around to tell. Well, you can imagine telling this friend, and then you'll be able to articulate a description in your mind, and it will make you pay more attention to the experience, even though you're not actually telling your friend in the moment. It'll be nice to tell them later when you get a chance, of course. Number three, you might take a picture of something involved in this positive emotion. Now, of course, you don't want to take too many pictures. That will take you outside of the moment, right? And you might lose your grip on the pleasure or the gratification that you're interested in. But one strategic picture would be helpful. Now, I would like you to go ahead and do this. I want you to pause the video when I give you the cue and perform this positive intervention. So let me tell you again. Think of a positive emotion that you're having right now, or perhaps nothing comes to mind. Think of a positive emotion from your past in that case, right? So if you're having a positive emotion right now, you can pause the video when you get the cue and go tell someone about it. Call someone on the phone, tell them about it, talk to someone in your house. Uh, Anyone will do. And if no one's available, then you can just imagine telling someone about this positive emotion. Finally, if no one's available and maybe you just don't like this approach, then you can go ahead and take a picture, right? Certainly, if you're having a positive emotion right now, you can take a picture of something that's involved in that positive emotion. If it's a positive emotion from the past, that's a little more tricky. Maybe you have a picture that involves that positive emotion. Go ahead and look at that picture, or perhaps it involves something, some object that's around you right now. Go ahead and take a picture of that. Okay, so this is your cue. Now you'll want to know, what are the positive outcomes associated with savoring? In other words, why should I do it? Why should I bother? Okay, well, Professor Laurie Santos, in her own course on the science of well-being, which you can find on Coursera if you like, in that course, she mentions three positive outcomes associated with savoring. Let me tell you what they are. Number one, savoring can thwart hedonic adaptation. That sounds pretty technical. Hedonic adaptation is getting used to a source of pleasure so that it no longer gives you as much pleasure as it did. Savoring can thwart that, meaning it can keep you from getting used to the source of pleasure so that it can continue to give you pleasure. Number two, savoring can help keep your mind from wandering. Even when something is pleasurable, we might quit paying attention to it, our attention might just drift away. But if we deliberately savor, we're not likely to do that. We're not as likely to allow our attention to lapse in that way. Number three, savoring can increase gratitude, which is a positive emotion. Remember, we started with a gratitude exercise. Gratitude is wonderful for us, and savoring can help increase gratitude. So those are great reasons to savor. Now we're ready to say something about the second element in PERMA, the E in PERMA, and that's engagement. What is engagement? Well, it's not an obscure term, right? Like savoring isn't an obscure term. So you roughly know what engagement is. Engagement is being involved, absorbed. If you're engaged with a task, then you do it with zest, you do it with relish, you're into it, something like this. If you have a high level of engagement, we might call that flow. And in fact, flow has become a technical term. There's been a lot of discussion of flow. There's been a lot of research on flow in psychology. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi wrote the book on flow. That is to say, he wrote a book about flow, and it's called Flow, and it's a sort of standard text on flow. Okay, so what is flow? As I've been suggesting, it's a high level of engagement. How do we get into flow? Well, we have to be using a high level of skill to do something, and it has to require a lot of our attention. Okay? So if we're doing a task that's challenging for us, but not too challenging, that would impede us, that would get us out of flow. It has to be just challenging enough, right? So we're operating at a high level of skill, using quite a bit of our capacity, using quite a bit of our attention. Okay, now we get into a flow state, and that involves not being very conscious of oneself. One loses track of time, one pays very little attention to oneself. So there's very little self consciousness in flow. And that's interesting, right? So we think of flow as being a nice thing. We might even think of it as pleasant. That is technically inaccurate, though, it seems. And that's because there's such a lack of self consciousness in flow that we don't really have the bandwidth for experiencing conscious pleasure. It's as if the task at hand is taking up all of our conscious bandwidth, right? And we just don't have room for anything except the task. Okay, so we want to be in flow. Flow is good. Even if it's not a conscious pleasure, we do like it. People report liking it, and it increases our skill level. It pushes us to the limits of our skill level and increases that skill level. How can you get more flow and thus more engagement in your life? Well, in order for me to answer that question, I need to tell you something about character strengths. From the point of view of positive psychology, character strength is a way to attain virtue, or a virtue, if you like, either way. Now, virtue here means a state of a human being, some state that we're in, that disposes us, creates a tendency in us to do good actions, right? So it's a disposition then, or a dispositional state. Since we're speaking from a psychological point of view and not from a philosophical point of view here, we might say it's a state that disposes one to do socially desirable actions, at least, since we're going to pretend that we have no rich conception of the good from a psychological point of view. Okay, so based on a great deal of empirical study, Christopher Peterson and Martin Seligman, in their Character Strengths and Virtues, a handbook and classification, have identified 6 virtues that are more or less universally valued by the human species. These 6 virtues are wisdom and knowledge. We count that as one, wisdom and knowledge. And then there's courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence. Most of these will be familiar. Transcendence is what it sounds like, somehow getting outside of yourself. Okay, so if you have a keen sense of spirituality, then you might be cultivating the virtue of transcendence. Okay, so there are these 6 virtues, and then there turn out to be, according to our studies, according to the studies of Christopher Peterson and Martin Seligman, there turn out to be 24 character strengths, 24 ways of attaining these 6 virtues. Okay. Now, since a virtue is a disposition to do good or socially desirable actions, that's what a character strength is as well once it's developed, right? Because it's a specific route to a specific virtue. So to give you an example, curiosity is what's called a signature strength for me. It's one of my greatest strengths, according to tests that I've taken. So I'm a very curious person. This is my character strength. This feeds into a virtue. You could probably guess which virtue, if you remember the list of virtues. It feeds into wisdom. Curiosity motivates me to learn more about my environment and learn more about human existence generally than other people who don't have that as their signature strength. It motivates me to learn more than I would if I weren't curious, right? So that's a character strength, feeds into virtue, basically. It disposes you to do good actions. It disposes me to become more wise, and then my wisdom disposes me to do other good things. That's the theory, right? Signature strength is a technical term, right? So I said curiosity is one of my signature strengths. Okay, so what that means is I'm energized by exercising that particular strength. I identify with that strength. I think of myself as a curious person anyway before I ever took any tests to determine that this was the case. I identified with curiosity. Um, Other people might unconsciously identify with their signature strengths. I certainly consciously identified with mine. And they're part of your identity. They're energizing. You want to exercise them, and so when you exercise them, you become more engaged. I hope that it is becoming clear that you can greatly increase your engagement level and thus experience greater flourishing or happiness by exercising your signature strengths. To do this, you must first find out what your signature strengths are. Fortunately for you, there is a free test you can take that will help you identify your signature strengths. One way to take this test is by going to the website for the VIA Institute on Character. The address is, as shown on the screen, www.viacharacter.org. When you get to the site, look for the button that reads Take the Free Survey. It will be on the top right of your screen. Okay, so I would like you to pause this video again so that you can take the free survey either at the VIA Institute's website or elsewhere. You could do a search for it and find the test at some other site. So go ahead and pause the video, please. Now you should know what your character strengths are. According to my survey results that I received from the VIA Institute on Character, my signature strengths are honesty, curiosity, judgment, perspective, and fairness, in that order. So, in other words, honesty ranks highest for me. Curiosity, which I already mentioned previously as one of my strengths, comes in second. Now that you know what your signature strengths are, you're ready to do this positive intervention that I have planned for you. I'll give you the cue to pause the video at some point, but here's the task. Identify a task that you find boring and or emotionally draining at work or at home. Redesign the task so that you get to exercise one or more of your signature strengths while you do it. For instance, one of the most boring tasks for me as a professor, just being honest, is grading. Remember, honesty is my number one strength. Okay, so grading is a bit of a bore. What I've done is I've redesigned some of my assignments so that the student has to incorporate some external research, not internal stuff that I've provided for them, but they have to go outside of the course, outside of what I've provided, to find some external research to incorporate into their work, right? And then I don't know what's coming as a result, and the student papers are more different from each other than they would otherwise be. And so I get to satisfy my curiosity because they're doing this external research, and they get to hone their research skills, right? So it's a win-win situation. So that's something that I've done for myself to allow me to exercise my signature strengths more than I otherwise would. Okay, so it's your turn. When I give you the cue, pause the video and identify that task that bores you and redesign it in such a way that you get to exercise one or more of your signature strengths as you do the task. Okay, go ahead and do that now. I want to round out this discussion of strengths and virtues and character strengths by offering you a reflection question. So when I give you the cue, please pause the video and answer this reflection question on the screen. You can answer it in your mind, you can answer it on paper, however you like. Please pause the video now. We are now ready to discuss the third element of PERMA, and that's the R. R stands for relationships, as I'm sure you recall. Aristotle famously noted that someone who appears to be a human being, but who can live outside of any human community or social group, is either a beast or a god. So either this person is so bestial that he or she cannot get along with anyone else and doesn't understand his or her own need for human sociality, or this person is just so self contained and so self sufficient that he or she is more like a god than like a human being. We normal human beings have to have others in our lives in order to be complete, in order to be whole. I'm as introverted as they come, but this is true of me just as much as other people that I know. So we're fortunate to be so easily able to virtually contact others, right? We've got our phones, we've got our laptops, we have a lot of devices we can use, a lot of software applications that we can use to virtually contact other people. So positive psychology in general recommends that we maintain this virtual contact with people during this difficult time when we're huddled together in our own homes. Now, I'm going to proceed on the assumption, the fairly safe assumption, that you have relationships in your life. And the question is, how can we make those better? How can we make those relationships better contribute to your happiness, your flourishing, and the happiness and flourishing of those others that you have the relationships with? Well, how about involving virtue in those relationships? Aristotle, again, I do have a soft spot in my heart for Aristotle. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he distinguished three different kinds of friendship. He distinguished friendships of utility from friendships of pleasure, from friendships of virtue, right? So I'm a friend to my bike mechanic, I think, my bicycle mechanic, in other words, and see him a lot, and I'm pretty friendly with him. That's a friendship of utility. I've never seen him outside of his bike shop. And there are friendships of pleasure. There are people that you would just have a drink with or a meal with. You wouldn't necessarily have any deep conversations, or maybe you'd go see a movie with that person, right? And then there are friendships of virtue, friendships based on our best qualities, in which we try to encourage those good qualities. We try to promote those good qualities in each other as much as possible. Aristotle held, and I certainly agree with him, that the friendship of the three, the kind of friendship of the three that is most stable, is also most beneficial to us. And that's the friendship of virtue, of course, right? What is useful to us changes over time and is fairly superficial anyway. Same with pleasure. What we find pleasant changes over time, and pleasure is a fairly superficial good in any case. Virtue, though, is deep. It's a deep part of one's identity once one has attained it, and it's stable once one has attained it. So, friendships of virtue are the best. Since friendships of virtue are the best, what we need to do in order to attain such friendships, if we don't have them already, is first of all, we need to find out what strengths and virtues our friends and loved ones possess, right? When we know what their strengths are, we can encourage them in their strengths. We've learned what our strengths are, and so we can just tell them what they are, and they can encourage us in our strengths. And that way we can build friendships of virtue. We're going to base a positive intervention on this. Here's how this positive intervention will work. First of all, you need to convince someone that you care for, someone who's close to you, to take the same strengths survey that you've already taken. And then you'll know what the signature strengths of this person are, right? Now you have a strengths conversation. That's the second step. What does that involve? Compare and contrast your strengths, right? So you might have some signature strengths in common. That would be nice. Talk about how you might exercise these shared strengths together in some activity or in daily life together, depending on who this person is, of course. Now, you might have divergent signature strengths. Maybe you don't have any in common. That's fine. Talk about how these different signature strengths complement each other. Discuss what you could do together to exercise these different strengths. For instance, my greatest strength is honesty. As I've mentioned, I have a friend whose greatest strength is humor. One of the things that we like to do is watch stand-up comics together and criticize them, right? She's enjoying the humor of it. I'm enjoying being honest about the comics skill level. And another thing that we could do, my my second greatest strength is curiosity, as I've mentioned. So another thing we could do is learn new jokes to tell each other. Perhaps we could do that once a week or once a month. I enjoy the novelty of it. Again, she enjoys the humor of it. Okay, so when I give you the cue, pause the video and engage in this positive intervention. Get as far as you can. I hope you get as far as planning a strengths date, an occasion on which you get to exercise your strengths together. We're now ready to discuss the fourth element of PERMA, which is the M, which stands for meaning. So, since it's part of PERMA, we do need meaning in our lives in order to flourish, in order to be authentically happy, if we want to put it that way. But what do we mean by meaning? This is something we need in our lives, but what are we really talking about? Fortunately, for us, my expertise is in the area of philosophy, and this is certainly something that philosophers like to talk about. What do we mean by meaning? What do we mean when we talk about the meaning of life in particular? Martin Seligman seems to take meaning to mean purpose when we're talking about the meaning of life or meaning in life. How do we know that? Well, when he talks about meaning, he generally turns that into discussion about contributing to something greater than oneself. So you have to make a contribution that sounds like a purpose or a goal, right? So Martin Seligman seems to have purpose in mind, goals, when he's talking about meaning in life. Now, this happens to jibe very well with the way that Susan Wolf, who is a philosopher, talks about meaning in life, right? So she eschews or avoids talk about the meaning of life. Her view is that there's no such thing as the meaning of life. There are different ways to live a meaningful life. So she talks about meaning in life, and she does tie meaning in life to some kind of purpose, just as Martin Seligman does. So we'll want to look at her work to flesh out Martin Seligman's ideas on meaning, which are perhaps underdeveloped compared to Susan Wolf's. Susan Wolf's view on meaningful lives, or meaning in life, as we keep saying, is laid out in her book entitled Meaning in Life and Why It Matters. In that book, she puts forward a view called the fitting fulfillment view. This fitting fulfillment view has two very important aspects to it. We could say simply, well, there's the fittingness and there's the fulfillment, but yeah, let's elaborate on that. So here's a way to think about the two requirements or the two aspects. Number one, we do often advise young people, do something you love. Doesn't matter what other people think, do something you love. So that's the fulfillment part of it. You need to do something that fulfills you, or that you love. There are different ways to put that requirement, but she thinks of it as a subjective requirement. You have to be invested, you have to care. Okay. The second requirement is an objective requirement. This fulfillment has to be fitting, right? It's the fitting fulfillment view. Or in other words, look, this thing that you love that fulfills you, it needs to have some objective value. And this actually ties into something we just discussed. We are social beings. We depend on each other. If I'm fulfilled by something and nobody else cares about it at all, right, then that project ends with me. It's over with me. It's hard to think of a life being meaningful when nobody else gives any concern about the project that I'm interested in, and nobody is going to carry it on in any way once I'm gone. That doesn't seem like a very meaningful life. And so we need some objective value in the object of love, in the object of fulfillment, right? So that other people will be able to sign on to the project that we're interested in. It might seem heroic to go it alone, and yet it also seems like it detracts from the meaning of one's life if one can't get others invested at all in what one is doing, if it makes no sense to them, if they don't see any value in it at all. Okay, so that allows us to arrive at the fitting fulfillment view. Okay, and then that leads us into a positive intervention. Now, this positive intervention, unlike the others, is not directly and specifically supported by the scientific evidence, right? Susan Wolf is a philosopher. She's not a psychology researcher, so she hasn't done studies or experiments to try to support her view. The positive intervention that I'm going to suggest now is based on her view, but also based on PERMA. So the positive intervention is not directly and specifically supported by the scientific literature, but it is indirectly and in a general way supported by the model of PERMA. Here are the instructions for our latest positive intervention. I need you to identify and consider the broadest, the most ultimate, the most overarching purpose or purposes that define your life. These should be purposes or goals that you've pursued for a very long time, that you pursue consistently. There should be subsidiary or auxiliary goals feeding into these most overarching purposes. And I want you to ask yourself, how much do I genuinely love pursuing these purposes? How much do they really fulfill me? Going back to that fitting fulfillment view. Number two, how objectively valuable are these purposes? Going back to the fittingness of the fitting fulfillment view. The second question is particularly difficult, so you might just try to situate the purposes. You might ask, regarding each ultimate purpose that comes to mind that you've considered, what more important purpose can I imagine someone pursuing? And what less important purpose can I imagine someone pursuing? This will situate the purpose or purposes for you in a spectrum of value, right? That'll help you get a handle on how objectively valuable you take these pursuits to be. Finally, based on the answers you've given, how might you modify these ultimate purposes that define your life? Is there one of them that needs to be replaced? Is there one of them that could be changed so that it's either more lovable for you or more objectively valuable? Now I would like you to pause the video in order to complete this positive intervention. We are now ready to discuss, finally, the fifth element in PERMA, the A, and the A stands for accomplishments, as you may recall. Now, we were just talking about overarching purposes in life that lend one's life meaning. When we think about accomplishments, we should think more local, more specific, right? Those overarching purposes, they're so broad and they're so big, there may not be a point, a specific point in time at which you think to yourself, I've done it. I've realized this overarching purpose of my life. My life is now meaningful. The goals that lend your life meaning tend not to be like that. But when we think of accomplishments in PERMA or in the context of PERMA, we should think about local specific goals that we can realize. We actually need accomplishments on a regular basis in order to flourish. Okay, so in connection with this notion of accomplishments, I want to introduce the work of Gabrielle Oettingen. Okay, now there are a lot of psychologists we could look at right now, a lot of work we could look at. There's a lot of work that's been done in the area of goal setting and goal achievement in psychology. But Gabrielle's work is important in positive psychology specifically, so let's hone in on what she has done. Her very big contribution to positive psychology is the WOOP method. The WOOP method, that's WOOP. It's an acronym, as you could probably guess. And what does it stand for? Well, the W is wish, and the first O is outcome, and the second O is obstacle, and the P stands for plan, right? So we have wish, outcome, obstacle, plan. That gives you a sort of schema for how to proceed with pursuing your goals. Let's elaborate. Well, first of all, you have to figure out what you want, right? The first step is wish. Figure it out. What do you wish for? What do you want? Number two, think about the outcome and don't just think about it, but fantasize a little, visualize it, ooh, wouldn't it be nice if I got what I wish for, because then my life would be like this, the outcome would be this. Now, you can't stop with the positive fantasy. You have to keep going and get to the next two steps, right? So, whoop isn't just positive thinking in the popular sense of that term. There's more to it. All right. So, you have to think about what's going to stop you from achieving your wish, your goal, what's going to stop you from getting what you want. Okay, that's the obstacle, or maybe there are obstacles in the plural, right? And then you need to have a plan. What are you going to do to overcome the obstacles? Now, it's very important when you get to step 4 to think in terms of specific, explicit, if then statements, right? The kind that are easily graspable. So let me give you an example. Maybe I want to lose 10 pounds because then I would fit into some pants that I've given up on, that I've discarded, right? Okay, so more specifically, I figure, well, if I quit drinking cafe mochas and I quit eating those ginger snap cookies, maybe I could possibly lose 10 pounds. So let's cut those out. Okay, so I wish to quit drinking cafe mochas, and I visualize getting into the pants, right? That's my outcome. I wish to not drink the cafe mochas. I'll get into the pants. What's the obstacle? Well, I really like cafe mochas. I'm gonna want one, right? What's the plan if I want a cafe mocha? If I find myself craving a cafe mocha, I will drink some black coffee instead, right? And we could do a similar thing with ginger snap cookies. And my plan could be, if I want a ginger snap cookie, I'm going to have a carrot instead. Okay? I will stick to that. All right. So you can imagine what kind of positive intervention I'd like you to do now. I want you to use the WHOOP method. Here are the instructions for your final positive intervention. I want you to use the WHOOP method in connection with at least one wish that you have. Okay, and I want you to be sure to go through each of the 4 steps. Remember, wish, outcome, obstacle, plan. I want you to go through those 4 steps, and when you get to step 4, I want you to use explicit if-then statements in your plan. Go ahead and pause the video now. Thank you for your participation in this webinar. I am honored to be with you today. Now, remember, the point of positive psychology is to become better, and we become better by doing. We have covered 6 positive interventions in this webinar. 5 of them are directly and specifically backed by the scientific literature. You could go back at any time to any of these positive interventions and do them again. If you skipped any of them on the way here to this point in the video, I encourage you to go back and get some benefit from those positive interventions. It's never too late to get some benefit from them. Thank you so much for being with me today.